All right, welcome everybody. My name is Timo Ylikoski. I'm a support consultant here at Zotec. And today, or the topic for today's webinar will be loops, what they are, how to use them, and what you can do with these. So the idea here is that I have a handful of slides here just to go through the basic concept of Winshuttle loops, what they are, why would you want to use them, or why do you need to use them, and then we'll switch over to Winshuttle Studio and go through an actual example. I'll go through a demo, record a transaction, and build a script for it using a loop, so you can see what it looks like in action. The looping is I think if you are fairly new to Winshuttle, this can be sort of a confusing topic because it requires that you use SAP in a way that you probably aren't normally used to using SAP, just to get everything recorded correctly with Winshuttle. But I'll do my best to explain everything here. Our time is fairly short here today, but I'll just go through the main concept, and then that should help you get started. There's actually a lot to learn before you can fully utilize loops. But let's just get started with this here. So a few words about the loop concept, as that might not be obvious to everybody what it is actually. Maybe you've seen Winshuttle loops in a demo somewhere, or in another script that your colleague has worked on, or maybe you're brand new to this whole looping thing. So this is a good place to start. So basically, the idea of the loop concept is that it is used to manage multiple line item entries in SAP. And these can be, you'll find these in lots of different T codes, different transactions. I have listed a few examples here, but I think sort of like the typical textbook examples would be something like sales orders. A sales order usually has one or more line items. Invoices have same kind of thing, ledger entries. Those are maybe the more typical examples where you have multiple line items in each record. But then there are other places like I have mentioned here, customer and vendors. Those can have multiple contact persons, for instance. So a customer can have 1 or 5 or any number of contact persons, for instance. Same with partner functions. Or you could run into loops when you're working with material master data, classification data, or for instance, alternative units of measure. A single material can have multiple alternative units of measure. So these kinds of things, you'll find these in, and there's many more examples. Those are just the first ones that came into mind, but you will run into these in various transactions in SAP. What these all have in common is that is this kind of one-to-many relationship, and that's sort of the point of the loop, why we need a loop. So well, for instance, sales orders, that will be the example we'll work through today. One sales order can have between 1 and an X number of line items, and the number of line items varies between sales orders. One order might have 5 items, another one might have 500 items. So it's a dynamically changing number, but there's always this kind of one-to-many relationship. And this applies to all of the examples above. For instance, one vendor can have multiple contact persons, or one material can have multiple different classifications, and so on. So that's sort of the idea. Anything that has this kind of one-to-many relationship, or a list of line items, that's where you will actually need to use a loop with Winshuttle. But I have here a couple of examples of, just to give you a better idea of what these are. So the things you should be looking for when you are planning on automating a transaction or process with Winshuttle Studio, you should look for things like this, like any screen in SAP that looks like this kind of table. That should be like the first cue. A little alarm bell should go off. remind you that, okay, this is something that requires a little bit of special attention from Winshuttle point of view. So it could be something like this in a sales order, or something like this with these are the contact persons, or it can look like this or that. The point is that you'll find these all over in SAP. They can be a little bit different when it comes to the layout and what kind of buttons and so on you have available there. But basic idea is that anytime you have a list in SAP where you will be adding multiple entries, that's when you will actually need to use a loop. So the way this would normally work, if you were, just forget Winshuttle for a second, if you were normally, let's say you were creating a sales order in SAP, you would just go into the transaction and start filling in line items in the table, one line at a time, like so. First item on the first row, second item on the second row, and then keep adding items. So this is nothing new here. This is how you would normally use SAP manually. But unfortunately, this doesn't really work with Winshuttle. You can't really script or record it like this. And this is sort of where it gets a little bit, I guess I can say a little bit weird, because you have to use or fill in the line items in a different order, or use different buttons and features in SAP to get it to record correctly. So instead of filling line items like so in this example, you would instead do it something like this when you are recording it with Winshuttle. So instead of adding items like we saw in the previous example, in this case, you would start by adding the first item on the second row of the table. Then you will need to find some way to manipulate the data. In this, I'll show you in practice how this works in this sales order example, but you somehow need to find a way to manipulate the data you just entered and sort of move it out of the way. So you press a certain button in SAP, which will then move the item we just entered, move it. In this case, it moves it up, leaving the second row empty and available for us to reuse. So then we would enter the second line item again on the second row of the table, and then do the same, repeat the same process, move it out of the way, again leaving the second row of the table free and available for line item entry. Third item, again on the second row. Fourth item, entered on the second row. So this kind of, you have to figure out a way to make this repeatable, so that it sort of keeps rotating. No matter how many times you do this, you'll always be adding items on the second row. And that's what makes it possible to loop this process. Because if we record it this way, then we can tell Winshuttle to repeat this. If an order has 5 items, we repeat these 5 times. If the order has 500 items, we repeat the same thing 500 times. And we are always entering items on the same row of the table here in this SAP view. It'll hopefully make a little bit more sense once I actually show it. I guess I'll show it to you first in SAP, and then we'll go through it again while we record the script. But before we get to that, a few common tips that should help you get started working with loops. The first important lesson here, and I think maybe this is one of the key points, and if there's only one thing you take away from this webinar, it should be this: you should learn to recognize when you need a loop. So we saw the few slides with the examples of different SAP screens that had this kind of list view in it, or a table, I should say. So that should be your cue to hopefully remember that this is something that will require a little bit of extra attention from Winshuttle point of view. We'll have to do something special to get it to record. Maybe you don't remember how exactly you should build the loop for it, but that should be a good starting point if you learn to recognize when you need loops, because then, which leads us to the second point. Once you know that this is something that will require a loop, you can next, like you do with anything, when you're not sure about how something works, you look it up online. You go to Google or whatever, or in this case, one good source is, or a resource is the Winshuttle support knowledge base, support.winshuttle.com. There are some pre-made how-to guides for I guess the most commonly used T codes. So like sales orders, maybe purchase orders. I don't remember, but there are a handful, maybe a dozen or so step-by-step guides that will show you how to correctly record those scripts, how to set up the loop. And then there's also a database of support articles where you can do a search for whatever it is. If you are working with material classification and you need a loop for that, you can maybe look it up there. So that's one good source. So if you don't necessarily know how exactly build the loop, if at least you know that you need a loop, then it makes it easier because you know that you'll need to start researching it. Otherwise, it will get frustrating if you don't know that you actually have to use a loop and you try to record it, but you can't get it to work because you don't know that you need a loop there. So that's a key thing here. Then, which is something that people often neglect. So once you know that you need a loop and you have maybe you found a guide on how to record it from the Winshuttle knowledge base, open up SAP. Just don't start immediately recording it. Go to the SAP, open up the transaction and sort of do a practice run. Go into the transaction and see how the looping would work. Do a few rounds, like I showed in the previous slide where we were entering items on the second row. Try that in practice so you know where to click, what buttons to press before you start the recording. And if it is a complicated script, I really recommend that you document it somehow. Maybe take screenshots of the SAP process so that later on you know how the script was made. It's really invaluable, especially if there's another developer that needs to take over. If you have a good documentation of how the script was recorded, that's really great. But not only that, it can prove to be really valuable to yourself as well, as we've actually seen in practice many times. Because it might be that this is a script that you make now and it worked fine for 2 years, but maybe later on you need to add something to it. But after 2 years, you probably have already forgotten how exactly you recorded it in the first place. So just for your own self, for your own use, it can really also be a big help to have a proper documentation of the process, how it was recorded and how the script was built. But I think now we can jump to Winshuttle Studio, or actually let's go to SAP first. So the example we'll be looking at today is VA01. We'll be building a script for sales order creation, where we will use a loop to add line items. So like I was saying earlier, what I recommend, first log into SAP, go to, in this case, VA01, and have a look at how the loop should work here and practice it before you start recording. Because when you are recording, at that point, you really can't make mistakes. At that point, you have to know what you are doing to get a nice, clean recording, to get everything to work smoothly. And we chose a sales order for the example here because I guess it should be relatively easy to understand. You have a sales order where you have some header level data like dates and who's the customer purchasing the items, and then you have the line items, and there can be a dynamically changing number of line items between different orders. So let's just go into here. It doesn't really matter much. We don't really need to actually post anything. We just go into VA01 and just try them. We want to practice the loop section here. So for the header, I need to provide a sold to and ship to party, and then we can move on to the actual loop section. And it's important also to differentiate between header level data and line item data. So all the data that I entered so far, on the first screen we had the sales area data, and on this screen we have the sold to and shipped to party, and there could be something, we could have a date here, for instance. That's all header level data, which means that each order will have only one single set of header level data. There's only going to be one single purchase order date or one single set of sold to and shipped to party customer numbers, for instance. But then the line items, that's the part that will be looped, though there can be multiple line items. And in this case, the way this works and what actually makes this sort of extra challenging to get started with is the fact that the way you build the loop varies between different transactions. So this is how we do it in VA01. If you're working with some finance transaction, FB, whatever, FB50, the way you do the loop is a little bit different. If you're working with material data, customers, vendors, whatever, in most cases, the way you actually record and build the loop is slightly different. So you have to figure out the correct procedure for each transaction. But like I mentioned, there are guides and documents for at least most of the commonly used T code. So it's not, so you don't have to be alone with this. But in this case, the way this will work is in VA01, we want to always enter new items on the second row of the table. So even though the first row is blank here, I'm not going to touch it. I'm going to enter a material number on the second row of the table, and we'll just use the bare minimum number of fields needed in this case. So I'll just use the material and the quantity, let's say one piece. If I were actually recording a proper script, I would then proceed filling in whatever fields we actually need to use and so on. But those are the two mandatory fields here. So now instead of pressing anything, I don't press enter or anything, but instead I go down here, and in this case, I want to look for a button with the green plus symbol here, button called create item. When I press this button, let's see what happens. It moves the material or the item we just entered on the second row. It pushes it up, just like we saw in the PowerPoint presentation. It moves up, leaving the second row empty again for us to enter a new item. And then I would go maybe to try another one, repeat the same steps, enter material number and quantity, click on the create item button, and let's see, does the same thing happen again? Yes, it pushes the existing entries up and leaves the second row empty and available for us to enter the next material. So in this way, repeat it a couple of times just to make sure that the whole process or the idea of repeatability and entering items on the same row of the table, just to verify that logic works. So it doesn't now matter if I do this 5 times or 500 times, it always works the same way. We enter an item on the second row. Once we press the create item button down here, it pushes the existing entries up. So that's the key thing with loops. You have to figure out a way to get it to work like this in this manner. So you have to manipulate the data, move them out of the way to be able to enter new items on the same row. It just happens that in this example, it's the second row we use. In some cases, some other transaction, you have to use the first row. Sometimes you use the very last row of the table. So that's sort of what makes this a little bit challenging, because this is not how you would normally do this when you would be manually creating an order in SAP. So it requires a little bit of different mindset when you start recording scripts with loops. And oftentimes people are they have this kind of almost muscle memory, so that they are used to doing it in a certain way, but you really want to break out of that and start thinking about things a little bit differently. I'm not going to save anything. We can just cancel this and exit out here. I just wanted to come here to test the loop logic so we can minimize our SAP GUI and switch over to Winshuttle Studio. So let's try next to record this process. So I'll click on transaction, create from SAP recording. I have my credentials stored here, so I can just click on to log on to SAP. and then we can start with the recording. Here I will specify the T code as usual. This case VA01. I'll leave the mode as is, standard mode, and then click start recording. And then shortly we'll be back in SAP in VA01. Let's see how long this takes. Today sometimes takes a while for us because we are using a remote SAP system. But okay, there we go. So just like before, we start filling in the sort of the header level data, like order types, whatever we have, sales organization, distribution channel, division. Click enter to continue, and then let's fill in. I'll use the same number here, just keep it simple. So that would be the header level data, and then I press enter, and then I can start entering the line items. Now, the thing is that even though we practiced doing this multiple times, I don't necessarily need to do it during the recording multiple times. I actually only need to do it once. If I do it correctly, once is enough. But maybe if you're first starting with this, you might want to practice this more. But once you are certain that you know how to build the loop, you know the steps, then once is enough. So basically all I need to do in this case is go to this, again, the second row. We want to enter a material here. I'll use the same materials, M11, let's say quantity 1. And then just like we just practiced, I'll click on the create item button. And again, this moves the created line up 1 row. And that's really it. I don't need to do it a second time. I practiced it. I know this is how it works, so I can actually just click on save to end the recording, which will then shortly take us back to Winshuttle Studio, and we can have a look at how to then configure the loop in Studio. But with loops, well, I guess with most scripts, the recording is the important part. But I think even more so with loops, because if you don't have the steps correct during the recording, it's often really hard, or might even be downright impossible to get it to work correctly with the loop if the recording is not right. So often you'll need to maybe redo the whole recording. And this example is really simple because we only have a couple of fields for the line items. We have the materials, the numbers, and the quantities. But there could be multiple screens, lots of fields of data for each line item. So you'll need to be careful and practice it before you start recording anything with loops. Now, if you were here last week when we talked about the basics of Winshuttle, or if you have been working with some basic Winshuttle scripts on your own, you've probably just been using the basic view here. But when we are dealing with loops, that's when we have to actually switch over to the expert view to be able to specify the loop section here. And if this is first time seeing this, it can look a little bit intimidating. You don't necessarily understand what this is. And going through all of the things we see here, what this is and what you can do here is quite a large topic in itself, and certainly out of the scope for this webinar. But sort of the few minimum basic things you'll need to understand here is that this is the recording in the and all the screens and the fields in the order they were encountered during the recording. So if you look at these rows with this kind of green background, that part is one SAP screen. And sometimes it depends what the descriptions are, but this is like says initial screen. So this was the first screen when we started the recording. It asks for the sales document type, organization, distribution, and so on. And here you can see the values we used. And then we pressed enter to move to the second row. Sorry, the second screen, which is where we entered the header level data, such as sold to party and shipped to party. And then let's scroll down a little bit. Then the next part is where we started entering line items. We only entered one line item, so that's it. And then the last screen is where we pressed the save command. So this is definitely a little bit challenging to learn how to interpret this, learn how to read this, but it does get a little bit easier once you start actually working with scripts. And a good example would be to sort of think about your recording, or maybe take a screenshot of this and then compare it to when you are running the script, to try to compare them like side by side, see what's happening, and try to follow here in the expert view what is happening. So you are starting on this screen, then going here, and then going here. Maybe that will help you understand this expert view. But the thing what we need to do here for this example is we need to identify where the line item entry happens. And in this case, it's this screen. Here we entered material number M11 and cumulative order quantity. I used 1, and then we clicked the create item button. So this is the section we want to loop. This is the section we need to repeat however many times is needed. So if there's 5 items for one order, we repeat this section 5 times. If another order has 500 items, we repeat this part 500 times. So what you can then do here is click on the sort of the first row here where you want your loop to start. Then you can hold down Shift and click on the last row of your what will essentially be the looped part. So just basically just select the rows here, and then from the top bar click on the Create Loop button, which will bring up this kind of loop creation dialog screen. You can also adjust the selected rows here if you didn't originally select the correct rows. We can, for instance, change the ending row, and you can see here in the background the selection changes. Just change the start and end point here if you need to adjust it. But that's those are the rows we selected. Those are the rows we want to repeat with the loop, so that's fine. And then we can specify the rest of the loop here. When using a loop, it also changes how sort of the layout of the Excel template as well. And this will show a nice little simple example here. So if this is a part we want to loop, Winshuttle will, when we specify or add a loop, Winshuttle will automatically add a new column to our Excel sheet. We don't have anything in our Excel at the moment, but technically you can do this in any order. You could first start mapping the header level fields and then add the loop. But I don't know, I like to do the loop, define the loop first and then do the mapping. So we'll say that Excel column A will be our so-called loop identifier column. So that will then, once we are done with this, it will look something like this. There will be a loop ID column in column A, which will have one of these values. We'll use the letter H to indicate that row of data is header level data, and then we'll use the letter D to identify that row in Excel is item level data in SAP. So then the template will look something like this. Then we have the ID column first, then on the header section you have data here. We would have like the order type and sold to party, shipped to party, so on, all the header level data. Then the repeating line items will be on subsequent rows of Excel marked with the letter D. So in this example, there would be one H row and then 3 D rows. This would mean that there would be 3 line items, each on their own respective Excel row. So there's going to be some like an empty space left here to have the line item data here. But these can also be changed, but often people commonly use the H and D identifier letter. So we can just click on OK and see what happens. Now, once we add the loop, a couple of things happen. First, the loop was added here to the expert view, this kind of yellow loop bracket indicating where the loop starts and where it ends. If we click on here, we can get back to the loop definition screen. If we made a mistake here, you can actually, if you select the row where the loop starts, you can right click here and select delete. That would remove the loop, but that looks fine. So this is the loop start, and here's where it ends. So it's only containing this single SAP screen. There are cases where you would want to put multiple screens inside the loop. For instance, if we wanted to go into the details for each of these line items, so instead of just entering the material number, maybe we'd go into one of the browse through the different tabs and fill in data on multiple screens. They would all need to then be looped here. But luckily our example is so simple, so we only have this one screen here that's looped. So that's one part. The loop is defined here. The second thing that happened is that Winshuttle or Studio automatically added a loop ID column to the beginning of our Excel template here. And it already pre-filled in the letters H and D on the sort of the second and third row of the Excel. So that's fine. Now that's pretty much all we need to do in the expert view, and we can switch back over to the good old basic view where we only see the fields that we had in the recording. So let's move this up a little bit and resize this guy, make some room. So now we can pretty much map this as usual. So let's say on column B, I want to put in, where do I start? Sales document type. So let's drag this over there, and we have sales document type mapped to this Excel column B. And it goes to the header row. And actually, it's automatically aligned on the correct row. So it doesn't really matter where I click here, where I drag from here. So I can click even down here. Just say that column C will be the sales organization, and the value will automatically go to the header row, because these are fields that are outside of the loop. These are not line item related fields, so Winshuttle will map them on the H row here, which is what we want. So let's just keep going. Distribution channel, division, couple of more header level fields, sold to party and ship to party. But now we get to this last two fields, which are now inside the looped section. So if I drag from column H, I want to put the material numbers here. I'll just drag it over the material number. Now what you'll notice is that the actual value is aligned on the D row. So Winshuttle Studio recognizes that this field is inside the loop, so it should go on the D row in Excel, which is what we want. So again, it doesn't matter what row I click on here. I can drag from the first row, drag it to the order quantity, and Winshuttle will automatically align it on the row that is assigned to it, or where the align item data goes, which in this case is the third row of Excel. And then finally, we, just like with any script, we have the run log, which we can then map here. That would be the mapping complete. Now we just have to add a few items and start testing, see how this works. So let's go ahead first and save this. So again, I'll just be lazy and use the default naming conventions for the files here. You probably want to use some kind of proper naming convention when you are working with your scripts, but we'll stick to those default names for now, and then we'll switch over to the Run tab here in Studio. So let's add a few more rows here. So I'll show you how the template then works. Let's just resize these couple of these a little bit to make a little bit more room. So the idea here is that on the H or the header row, we have the header level details. And then every D row following that are line items belonging to this same sales order. So there's already one line item. If we wanted to add another one, I would put in the capital letter D here and then fill in the next item here, like so. If I wanted there to be 3 items, the third one would go here, and then I just have to make sure that the item data is aligned on the correct rows here, like so. Now, since we want to be able usually to create multiple records, multiple sales orders in this case, we can use the same template for mass uploads. So instead of adding another D row, what I can do is add another H row to indicate that this is the next sales order. So when we run the script, Winshuttle will be looking at the ID column to see whether the data on that row is header level data for a new order, or whether it's D as in detail items belonging associated with that same order. And then when a new H row is encountered, then Winshuttle recognizes that this is okay, this is now the next order, and then we can start filling in the data for the next order, starting with header level data, and then start filling in line items for this order. So it would be something like this, whatever. So let's add a couple of rows here. So let's say this would be an order. The first order would have 3 items, 3 D rows. The second order would have 2 items, 2 D rows. Let's just quickly copy paste this so we get a few more rows of data in our Excel here. So the template will look something like this. Some people like to add things like conditional formatting to the Excel templates. For instance, change the background color of the H rows to make it easier to see where a new order starts. So that's definitely something you can then do in Excel to fine tune and make your template more readable, easier to understand, for instance. But for our purposes, this is fine. We can now run it and see how this works. So I'll just go ahead and click on the run button to run my script, and then we'll see what happens and what the log messages look like here. So since we are using this kind of a looped template with line items, the log messaging will be also a little bit different. The way this works is that on the header row, we'll get the actual log message saying, in this case, standard order, then the order number has been saved, indicating that this order was successfully saved. And then on the next 2 rows, it just says item row, see log above, just to tell you that this is item level data related to this order. And then it repeats the actual log message on the last line item. So that would be one order created in SAP. This would be another one. Oops, there's actually 2 D rows. This would be another one, and so on. There's one. So it looks like all 4 orders were successfully created in SAP. Well, what I often like to do when testing or when sort of illustrating this to people, or what you can also do to see how this is actually working. Let's clear up some rows and just do one order, maybe add a couple of more items to that sales order. So here we have one order with however many, that is 5 items. Let's save this, and I will run this in the debug mode just to sort of further illustrate how the loop is working. So we can then see how the script is being run in a step-by-step mode in SAP. So the debug run will run the script, but instead of just running it in the background, it'll open up the SAP GUI and it'll go through the script one step at a time, allowing us to pause in each step and then see what the script is doing, how the script is being run in SAP. It takes a little bit longer to start here because it's actually launching SAP GUI. But here we go. So if you're not familiar with the debug run, it runs the script in a mode where it pauses on screen and actually waits for user input. Yeah, it gives you this control box where you can click on this enter button to continue to the next screen. So you can see that all the values in red font are values uploaded by Winshuttle from Excel. So you can see that Winshuttle is filling in the order type and the fields here. Then it's clicking enter to continue. Then on this screen, Winshuttle is filling in the sold to party and shipped to party. And then it starts moving on to the sale, line item creation. Well, unfortunately, it's just barely visible here, but it's entering an item on the first row and then clicking on the create item button. So there's the first item. So you can see it keeps adding items on the second row here when I click this button here, second, third, fourth, like so. So it keeps adding in this case, all the 5 items on the second row, and then it presses the save button. So the debugging is intended for debugging purposes when you are troubleshooting errors, just to see where the script is failing. But you can also use it to run a working scripts just fine, just to see what exactly Winshuttle is doing in SAP. So that's the idea of the loop. So it's just a few main points just to recap a little bit is to first of all to figure out how to do the loop. And like I said, there are lots of documentation for many T codes. But if you're working with something more exotic, then you kind of just have to go into SAP and start testing out things, do a little bit of investigation work, try to figure out how to best get the looping, the repeating thing to work, how to always add items on the same table row, and then you practice that and record it like that, and then the final part is to build the loop and template, which will look like this then in Excel. I have as an example, I have a couple of slides here just to further illustrate the point that the loops are built differently depending on what T code you are working on. So the VA01 is a relatively simple way to build the loop like that. You just have to know to enter item data on the second row and then click on the create item button, and that's it. That should help you get the loop recorded correctly. But just as an example, a few other cases I have collected here just to show you how this can be different. Here's an example of a general ledger posting in FP50, a financial document, where the steps are as follows. Instead of adding data on the second row like we saw in the sales order example, in this case we want to add data on the first row of the table, the very first row, and then we enter fill in whatever fields we need here. Then we select the first row by clicking the button in front of the row to select it and highlight it, and then we click an insert row button down here. So unfortunately, SAP is not very consistent when it comes to different screens and different buttons and functions. So in some cases, you have to use different buttons and use different rows to enter your data. So in this case, in FP50, we fill in data on the first row and press this insert row button down here. And then in this example, it actually works kind of the data goes in the opposite direction. So once you press the insert row button down here, it actually pushes the item we just entered pushes it down one row, leaving the first row empty. So then we can enter the next line item again on the first row. And then you keep repeating this. You press the insert row button, insert the next item on the first row of the table. And all the while, every time you repeat this, the previous entries will be pushed down one row. And that's the key. That's how you get the loop to work in FP50. Another different example from adding contact persons. And the point here is not for you to learn how to do these exact examples. This is just to illustrate that the way you build the loop varies between transactions, and sometimes you really have to think outside the box to do something quite different than you would normally do in SAP. For instance, adding contact persons, you use the department filter down here to enter a value, a department that you know is at the sort of the end of the list. So we use for these Z, because that's definitely going to be in the end of the alphabet. So when you enter this department here and press enter, it actually will push up the contact person list, leaving, regardless of how many records, how many contact persons you have on this screen, when you enter this department and press enter here, it'll push everything up, leaving the second row of the table empty and available for us to use. So then we would enter a new contact on row 2, then repeat this. Do the filtering again, press enter, the list moves up, enter the next contact person on row 2, and then so on. And that's the key thing here, to get this to repeat correctly and to be able to use a loop with that. This is actually an example that there was a script, this exact same process I was working on, and I didn't know how to do the loop for this myself. And I went into the Winshuttle knowledge base, the support portal, and looked up. You can look up XT02 or just type in adding contact or just contact persons, and then there an article pops up which actually shows you this exact same example. So that was where I found out the way to correctly record and build a script for this, and that is an immense help, because otherwise you would have to figure this out for yourself, and it's kind of difficult to figure out that you need to or that you can use the department button here to manipulate the data in the list. But in this case, that might be the only option here, because there aren't really buttons down here like we saw in the previous examples. There's no create item or add line or things like that. So the buttons and features you have in these SAP available in each SAP screen can be quite different between different transactions. So you are really at the mercy of whoever designed these T codes in the first place. And one final example here is this is adding activities for networks in CN22. Again, we see a list here that would be the indicator for us that this is something that requires a loop. And in this case, there's again really no buttons down here that would help us build a repeatable loop for this. But in this example, we use the buttons up top here called the last page and next page. So the process in this case, when recording it, would be to first press the last page button, then the next page button. This moves the list up, and then we can enter a new activity on row 2. Then we repeat, start from the top. Press last page again, next page, list moves up, new activity entered on row 2. That way we can make this repeatable. So this is just to show you that there are multiple ways to build loops, and it differs. It depends on the transaction you are working on, what process you are recording. So you have to use different buttons. But the key point here is that you somehow have to find a way to manipulate the data in the list here to get the existing entries to move out of the way and to be able to enter new items always on the same row of the table. Whether it's the first row or the second row, again, that depends on the T code, but that's the idea. That concludes our presentation and demo for today. That's probably a lot to digest, and I really recommend that this is something, if you need to build a loop in your script, start slow, start practicing it first in SAP GUI. Look up the online resources, look it up in the Winshuttle support portal, or contact our support just first to see if there is an existing guide for how to build the script, or just ask for tips on how to go about, so you don't have to be alone with these scripts, because it can be frustrating to start with, because if you're not super familiar with the whole looping concept, it will be a little bit difficult to get started with it, and it will probably take a few tries. You probably will need to re-record the script a couple of times before you really start to understand how the looping works, and how to first, even just how to read the expert view, how to understand your recorded script. But it definitely does get easier over time. So we still have a few minutes if anybody has any questions. The floor is open. You can go and ask away, or type in the chat, whatever you prefer. By no means this was not meant as like a comprehensive guide to all things loops. This was more like just an introduction to give you hopefully a good idea of what the loops are, and why you would want to use them, why you need them. And like I said earlier, I guess the first step would be to learn to recognize the need for loops when you actually need a loop, because then that will go a long way. Then you can start looking at existing solutions, or look at online resources for tips, and also our training site. There's I think a little bit more detailed training video regarding loops that you can look at if you need it. And also this webinar will be posted online later today, I think, so you can then come back and review this. But if there aren't any questions, then I thank you all for joining this session today. And if you are joining us next week, then we'll continue with, I think next one will be on long texts, how to manage and work with long text objects. So maybe I'll see you guys there. Otherwise, I wish you all a great day, and have fun working with loops. Thank you.
Thank you.